David Okoro had it all: a sprawling mansion tucked away in the heart of Lagos, an influential business empire, and a picture-perfect family. His wife, Amina, was the epitome of grace and sophistication, always seen with a smile that masked a complex world of unspoken truths. Together, they seemed like the perfect couple, admired by their friends, respected by colleagues, and envied by those around them. Yet beneath this shiny exterior, things were far from perfect. David's wealth had come through years of hard work, but his obsession with success had driven him to neglect the people who mattered most. He spent long hours in the office, attending meetings, making deals, and ensuring his empire grew. Amina, despite being beautiful and intelligent, felt the cold emptiness of a marriage that had become more about status than genuine connection. But David, always distracted by his work, never noticed. He didn't notice that their conversations were becoming fewer, or that the warmth in their home had slowly faded away. What he didn't realize was that Amina, despite her perfect outward appearance, was growing lonely, disillusioned with their life. Chinyere, their housemaid, had been working for them for years. At first, she was just another face in the background, performing her duties with diligence and obedience. She was quiet, unobtrusive, and always seemed content with her place in the world. Yet, over time, something between her and David shifted. She had worked for many wealthy families, but there was something different about the way David treated her. He'd often linger for moments longer than necessary, offering kind words and compliments that seemed innocent on the surface, but to Chinyere, they felt like a flicker of warmth she had been missing in her own life. It began innocently enough. A few shared smiles during the late-night cleaning sessions when Amina was away at social events. Then there were the late-night conversations over dinner, where David would talk about his struggles, his hopes for the future, his disappointment in his marriage. Chinyere, young and naive, listened and empathized with the man she had come to admire. In the back of her mind, she knew it wasn't appropriate, but in a world where emotional connection was scarce, David's attention felt like a lifeline. The affair began one evening when Amina was away on business. David and Chinyere had been talking for hours, about their pasts, about the loneliness they both felt, and the emotional distance between them bridged with a simple touch. It wasn't planned, but in that moment, they both surrendered to the vulnerability of the situation. What started as a fleeting, impassioned moment blossomed into something deeper. Their secret was kept, hidden away from prying eyes, but it weighed heavily on both of them. As the weeks passed, David became more and more involved with Chinyere. He told himself it was just a phase, that it would end once Amina returned, once things got back to normal. But things never really went back to normal. Chinyere, with her quiet strength, never complained. She knew her place, and she knew she was risking everything. But in the isolation of her life, David's attention was intoxicating. They both became trapped in their own web of deceit, a web that was slowly beginning to unravel. Then came the day that changed everything. Amina, suspecting something was off, confronted David about his behavior. It had been weeks since Chinyere had left for a supposed vacation, and Amina had noticed the distance between them had only grown. She knew something wasn't right. She didn't confront David with accusations, but instead, she made a pointed comment about how quiet the house had become. David brushed it off, but inside, he could feel the heat of the secret burning between them. Days turned into weeks, and Chinyere returned, no longer the young, naive maid who had first entered their home. She had changed, there was something different in her eyes. And as fate would have it, David soon learned that she was pregnant. At first, the news didn't seem real. He'd heard of such things happening, but never imagined it would happen to him. The shock of the revelation hit him like a sledgehammer. It wasn't just the pregnancy, it was the weight of everything that had come before it, the affair, the lies, the guilt. David was left speechless. The perfect life he had carefully built was crumbling before his eyes. The weight of his actions came crashing down on him, and he realized he had lost control. What did he do now? How could he face Amina, the woman who had loved him unconditionally for years, only to betray her in the most intimate of ways? How could he ever look at Chinyere the same way again, knowing that their shared secret had led to a life-altering consequence? But the shock wasn't over. The real twist came when David discovered something he wasn't expecting. Chinyere, despite the tension and the betrayal, was not seeking his help or sympathy. Instead, she was leaving. She was going to raise the child on her own, away from the tangled web of lies they had all created. The real shock wasn't the pregnancy, it was the fact that Chinyere had made a decision to step away, to not let David's wealth or guilt trap her in a situation she no longer wanted to be a part of. This revelation left David stunned. He couldn't comprehend the complexity of what had just unfolded. Chinyere's pregnancy wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would change not only her life but his, and Amina's, forever. Little did David know that the moment Chinyere left the house was just the calm before the storm, and the consequences of his actions would ripple through their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. David sat in his study, a room that had always been his sanctuary, but today, it felt more like a prison. His mind raced, replaying the events of the past few weeks, trying to make sense of the whirlwind that had torn apart his carefully constructed life. The news of Chinyere's pregnancy had struck him like a bolt of lightning, leaving him in a state of disbelief. But it wasn't just the pregnancy, it was the realization that he had betrayed the woman who had stood by him through everything, his wife Amina. The guilt weighed heavily on his chest, but there was something else gnawing at him, something that wouldn't let go. David's thoughts kept returning to the moment when Chinyere had left. She had made her decision with a quiet resolve that both surprised and confused him. She hadn't demanded anything, not money, not a relationship, not even an apology. She had simply said, "I need to go." And with that, she had walked out of his life. There was a strange sense of relief in her departure, as if she had freed herself from the trap they had both been caught in. But at the same time, a sense of loss hung in the air. David couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost, something he wasn't ready to face. Amina had known about the affair long before the pregnancy news broke. David had been so wrapped up in his own world that he hadn't noticed the subtle changes in his wife. She had become quieter, more distant, and though her love for him was evident, there was a coldness in her eyes that David had never seen before. It wasn't until the pregnancy revelation that Amina had finally confronted him, not with anger, but with a calm acceptance that chilled him to the bone. She didn't shout, she didn't cry. She simply asked, "How long were you planning on hiding it from me?" David's heart sank as he recalled that conversation. He had tried to explain, to apologize, but Amina's gaze had been unwavering. She had known. She had known for months, perhaps even longer, that something wasn't right in their marriage. David had been so consumed with his own guilt and shame that he had failed to recognize the signs. Amina hadn't just suspected, she had seen the subtle exchanges, the lingering glances, the moments when David's attention had wandered from her to someone else. The truth hit David like a freight train. Amina had been living with the knowledge of his affair for longer than he had imagined. She had watched him drift away, watched as he became more absorbed in his business and less present in their marriage. And yet, she had said nothing. She had stayed silent, unwilling to rock the boat, to upset the life they had built together. David had taken her silence as a sign of compliance, but it was not compliance. Amina had been quietly suffering, grieving the loss of her husband long before the affair had even begun. As David sat in the study, the weight of his own actions pressed down on him. He had assumed that Amina would forgive him, that with time, they could move past the affair and rebuild their marriage. But now he realized how naive he had been. Amina's quiet strength, her stoic demeanor, had masked a deep well of pain that he had never bothered to understand. She had been his partner in every sense of the word, but David had failed to see her as anything more than the perfect wife, the woman who was always there, always understanding, always willing to let him be. David's mind drifted back to Chinyere. What had she really wanted from him? Why had she allowed this affair to happen? He had convinced himself that it was just a moment of weakness, a fleeting lapse in judgment. But now, in the quiet of the study, he realized how much deeper it had run. Chinyere hadn't just been a maid, she had been a person who had been looking for something more than what her life had given her. She had come into their home with hopes and dreams of her own, and David, with his own loneliness and emptiness, had offered her something she hadn't known she needed. Their connection had been more than just physical, it had been an emotional escape for both of them, a fleeting glimpse of something better. But now, with the pregnancy news hanging over him, David was left to question everything. He tried to put the pieces together, but they didn't fit. How had it all spiraled so quickly? He had thought the affair would remain a secret, buried in the shadows, but now it was out in the open, and nothing would ever be the same again. Amina, to her credit, had not made any rash decisions yet. She had remained calm, had not yet made any accusations, but David knew it was only a matter of time before she would demand answers. He didn't know what to say, what to do. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't change the choices he had made. All he had now was the truth, and it was a truth that would destroy everything if it were fully revealed. In the midst of his turmoil, David decided to reach out to Chinyere. He needed to speak to her, to understand what had driven her to this point. He needed to know if there was any hope of salvaging this situation or if everything was truly lost. But when he tried to contact her, there was no response. Chinyere had cut all ties with him, her silence was as deafening as Amina's had been. It was then that David realized, he had lost not only Amina, the woman he had vowed to love, but also the one person who had made him feel alive in ways he couldn't describe. As the days turned into weeks, David's guilt began to consume him. His work felt meaningless, his accomplishments hollow. The luxury that had once been a symbol of his success now seemed like an empty shell, a reminder of all that he had failed to protect. His business dealings, once his pride and joy, now felt like distractions from the chaos of his personal life. The mansion that had once been a symbol of his triumph now stood as a monument to his failures. It wasn't until he saw the first report in the tabloids that the full extent of the scandal hit him. The affair was now public knowledge. Pictures of Chinyere, her pregnant belly barely visible under the loose clothing, were plastered across the pages. The media had a field day, speculating about the identity of the father, and David's name was mentioned in every article. It was no longer a private affair, it was a public spectacle, and David's life was unraveling faster than he could keep up. But the real shock came when he learned that Chinyere had disappeared, leaving no trace behind. She had gone into hiding, presumably to avoid the public eye, but David couldn't help but wonder if she was running from him, from the consequences of their actions. He knew now that the affair, the pregnancy, and the secrets had become a burden too heavy for Chinyere to bear. And as he sat in the study, David realized something else. He had been selfish, only thinking of himself and the fallout that would come. But Chinyere had her own life to lead, her own future to consider, and the choices they had made together had irreparably changed the course of both their lives. As the media frenzy intensified, David found himself at a crossroads. He could either continue living in denial, trying to protect what little remained of his reputation, or he could face the truth and begin the difficult journey of atonement. But deep down, David knew that no matter what he chose, nothing would ever be the same again. The world he had known, the life he had built, had already shattered beyond repair. And now, he had to decide if he was willing to face the consequences of his actions, or if he would let them consume him entirely. David woke up to another morning of uncertainty. The silence in the house was suffocating, the absence of Chinyere more deafening than the chaos outside. His mind was clouded with regret, guilt, and confusion as he moved through his morning routine mechanically, almost numb to the lavish surroundings that once filled him with pride. The mansion, with its sprawling rooms and extravagant furniture, now felt hollow, an empty shell that mirrored the emptiness inside him. The sounds of the city beyond the gates felt distant, like they were part of another world, one he no longer belonged to. Amina hadn't spoken much in the past few weeks. Since the truth came out, she had remained silent, her demeanor cold and distant. Every time David tried to approach her, she would give him a curt response, avoiding eye contact, as if he no longer existed in her world. The ache in David's chest grew deeper with each passing day. The woman he had married, the woman who had been his partner for years, was slipping away from him. He couldn't bear to think about how much he had hurt her, how he had betrayed not just her trust, but the very foundation of their life together. But what made it even worse was the fact that Amina wasn't angry. She wasn't confronting him with accusations or tearful pleas. Instead, she was shutting him out. She had already made her decision, and David could feel it, even though she had never said the words aloud. The media frenzy was relentless. Each day, the headlines seemed to grow more sensational, more intrusive. Pictures of Chinyere, her pregnancy now unmistakable, were splashed across every tabloid. Some outlets speculated on the identity of the father, while others reveled in the details of David's fall from grace. His once glamorous image, carefully crafted over years of hard work, was now tainted. The whispers in the streets were louder than ever, rumors about his affair, his infidelity, and the scandal that was rocking his family. Friends and business associates began to distance themselves, no longer willing to be associated with the man whose name had become synonymous with disgrace. Every call David received now came with a sense of judgment, whether veiled in sympathy or thinly disguised disdain. The pressure from his business dealings only heightened the sense of despair. Meetings that once excited him now felt like tedious obligations. The board members he had once charmed with his confidence now looked at him with skepticism, wondering if his personal life was starting to affect his professional capabilities. David knew he had to pull himself together, to focus on his company, but the weight of the situation was too much. How could he focus on a business empire when his personal life was in shambles? How could he look anyone in the eye when he knew he had failed on every level? In the quiet of the evening, as he sat alone in the living room, David found himself reflecting on the past. He thought about his relationship with Amina, about the days when they were first married, when their love felt genuine, when the world seemed to promise them endless possibilities. He remembered the small gestures, the quiet moments of affection, the shared dreams of a future that now felt so distant. Somewhere along the way, they had drifted apart, their connection lost in the whirlwind of ambition and success. David had focused so much on building his empire, on chasing after wealth and power, that he had forgotten about the things that truly mattered, the people who had always been by his side. But Amina wasn't the only person who had been affected by his choices. There was Chinyere, the young housemaid who had entered his life with nothing but a quiet hope for a better future. David couldn't help but think about her, about the woman who had unexpectedly become entwined in his world. He had convinced himself that their connection was nothing more than a momentary lapse in judgment, an affair that would be forgotten once the dust settled. But it was more than that. Chinyere had been searching for something, just as he had. She had felt lost, vulnerable, and in David, she had found someone who seemed to offer her a way out of her circumstances. Their relationship had never been just physical, it had been an emotional escape for both of them. But now, with the pregnancy, everything had changed. Chinyere had made it clear that she was leaving, that she no longer wanted to be a part of the mess David had created. David tried to contact her, but it was no use. She had disappeared, vanishing without a trace. He had no idea where she was or how to find her, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. He wanted to make things right, to apologize for what he had done, but he couldn't help but feel that it was too late. Chinyere had made her choice, and so had he. There was no turning back now. The weeks turned into months, and the consequences of David's actions began to ripple through every aspect of his life. Amina, despite her outward calm, had made it clear that she was no longer interested in being married to a man who could betray her in the most intimate of ways. She had moved out of their shared bedroom, taking only what she needed, and began living in one of the guest rooms. There were no angry outbursts, no dramatic confrontations, just silence, a coldness that cut deeper than any argument could have. She had made her decision, and David knew that it was only a matter of time before she would ask for a divorce. The thought of losing Amina, of losing everything they had built together, was almost too much for David to bear. But he knew he couldn't blame her. What could he say? What could he do to fix what was broken? The betrayal was too great, and the distance between them was too wide. In the face of the truth, there was no easy way out. He had no answers, no quick fixes. All he had was the knowledge that he had destroyed the most precious thing in his life, and now, he would have to live with the consequences. The media continued to hound him, digging deeper into his past, uncovering every flaw, every mistake, every misstep. David's once pristine reputation had been shattered, and now, he was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a man who had it all and lost it all in the blink of an eye. He had hoped the scandal would die down, that the public's fascination with his downfall would fade, but it didn't. Every day, the press seemed to find new angles, new ways to expose him, to tear him down further. He was a pariah, a symbol of the dangers of wealth, power, and infidelity. And through it all, David couldn't escape the nagging question that haunted him: what had he really lost? It wasn't just the trust of his wife or the respect of his colleagues. It was his own sense of self. He had built his life on the pursuit of success, on the idea that wealth and status were the ultimate goals, but now, he saw how hollow it all was. The mansion, the cars, the luxuries, they meant nothing. What good was it all if he couldn't look at himself in the mirror without feeling shame? In the end, David knew that no amount of money, no success, no luxury could fix what was broken. He had to come to terms with the reality that his life would never be the same. Amina was likely gone for good, and Chinyere had already moved on. He was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been shattered by his own choices. And in the silence of the mansion, David found himself asking the hardest question of all: was it with David's days blurred together in a haze of regret and uncertainty? The once bright and bustling life he had built now felt like a distant memory, an illusion that had faded into the background of a harsh new reality. He no longer enjoyed the daily routines that once gave him comfort. The hustle of his business, the intricacies of his deals, the chatter of his colleagues, everything seemed shallow, meaningless, like the backdrop to a drama that he had no part in. He had once believed that success was the key to happiness, that wealth and status could insulate him from the struggles of ordinary life. But now, with his empire crumbling, he realized how terribly wrong he had been. Every morning, as he wandered the halls of his mansion, David was confronted by reminders of his failure. The grand paintings on the walls, the expensive furniture, the meticulously landscaped garden, all of it now felt empty. The mansion no longer felt like home. Amina's absence, the quiet distance between them, had turned the space into a cold, sterile environment. It was as though her spirit had once filled the home, and without her, it had become an oppressive, lifeless shell. David had tried, in vain, to reconcile with Amina. He would sit for hours, drafting letters, composing words that he hoped would make her understand, but every time he attempted to reach out, he felt a growing wall between them. The letters remained unsent, and the calls went unanswered. She had closed herself off, and David didn't know how to break through. It wasn't that he didn't love her anymore, it was that he had hurt her in ways that words could never undo. And no matter how many times he apologized, no matter how much he begged for her forgiveness, the damage seemed irreversible. He tried to immerse himself in his work, but his mind couldn't stay focused. His company, once a thriving success, was beginning to suffer. Investors pulled out, the value of his assets plummeted, and whispers of his scandal spread through the business world. Even his most loyal employees started to question his leadership. The pressure was unbearable, and for the first time in his life, David felt like he was losing control. The empire he had built, the symbol of his power and ambition, was slipping through his fingers. It was a late evening when David received the call. He hadn't expected it, didn't know what to make of it, but when he picked up, the voice on the other end sent a chill down his spine. It was the lawyer. The lawyer who had represented him in his business dealings, the one he had trusted with his most sensitive affairs. And now, this lawyer was calling to inform him of something that would change everything. Amina had filed for divorce. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The realization hit David like a sledgehammer. He had always known that the possibility of divorce was there, but he had never truly believed it would come to this. Amina had always been the strong, silent type, the one who endured, who kept things together when it felt like everything else was falling apart. He had taken her strength for granted, had assumed that no matter what he did, she would always be there. But now, the woman who had once been his everything was taking steps to free herself from the chains of their marriage. David's heart sank as the weight of the decision settled on his chest. He sat in silence for a long time, the phone still pressed to his ear, unable to process what he had just heard. A divorce was inevitable, he knew it. He had lost her, he had lost Amina for good. And this time, there was no way to fix it. The affair had done irreparable damage to their marriage, and the pregnancy, the child, was the final straw. Amina was no longer interested in fighting for a relationship that had been built on lies. She was moving on, as much as it broke her heart to do so. In the weeks that followed, the divorce proceedings moved quickly. There was no fighting, no bitterness, no grand legal battles. Amina had already made her decision, and there was nothing David could do to change her mind. She took what was rightfully hers, the home, the assets, the children, and left David with nothing but the wreckage of his own decisions. With Amina gone, David was left to confront the consequences of his actions in a way he had never imagined. He was alone now, completely isolated. The mansion felt even more desolate without her. He wandered through the empty rooms, searching for something to hold on to, but there was nothing left. The life he had once been so proud of had crumbled to dust. He could no longer pretend that he had it all together. His success, his wealth, his reputation, none of it mattered anymore. The things he had once worked so hard for now felt like chains, weighing him down. David turned his focus to his business, desperate to salvage what he could. But it wasn't easy. His reputation was in tatters, and investors who had once been eager to back his ventures were now pulling away. The stress was mounting. Every day felt like an uphill battle, and yet, he couldn't find the energy to care the way he used to. His heart wasn't in it anymore. It was hard to summon the passion that had once driven him. The joy he had found in his work had been stripped away, replaced by a sense of obligation and guilt. He felt like a shadow of the man he used to be. It was during this time of deep introspection that David began to realize something. He had been living a life of superficial success, chasing after things that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. The wealth, the power, the status, they had all been distractions, ways to fill the emptiness inside him. He had used them to avoid confronting the deeper truths about himself, the parts of him that he had tried so hard to suppress. His affair with Chinyere had been just another attempt to escape from the reality of his own shortcomings, to fill the void with something, anything. But now, with everything falling apart, he could no longer ignore those truths. David had been running from himself for so long, afraid to face who he had become. But now, in the silence of his empty mansion, he had no choice but to confront the man in the mirror. He had been selfish, reckless, and blind to the pain he had caused. He had destroyed the trust of the people he loved most, and no amount of wealth could bring that back. He had lost his wife, his family, his reputation, and for what? The pursuit of an empty dream? The false belief that success could fill the hole in his heart? As the weeks turned into months, David's once vibrant world continued to fall apart. But in the midst of the chaos, something shifted inside him. The realization that he couldn't continue down the path he was on became undeniable. He couldn't fix the past, couldn't undo the damage he had caused. But he could make a choice to be a different man moving forward. It wasn't an easy decision. The weight of his mistakes hung over him like a dark cloud. But David knew that if he didn't change, if he didn't take responsibility for his actions, he would lose everything, including himself. For the first time in a long time, David made a vow, not to restore his wealth or reputation, but to restore his own integrity. The road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and setbacks, but David was determined to walk it. He couldn't erase the past, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could begin to rebuild his future, one where he would no longer hide behind his success, but face his mistakes head-on. David's transformation wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. The realization that he had to change came with its own weight, pressing him down in ways he hadn't anticipated. Every attempt to rebuild his life felt like a futile struggle against the inertia of his past mistakes. The shame was suffocating, and every corner of his existence seemed to remind him of what he had lost. He could no longer pretend that wealth, power, and influence were the pillars that supported his life. They had been illusions, distractions from a deeper need for self-understanding and authenticity. His first step toward change was to confront the people he had wronged, Amina, Chinyere, and himself. He knew that the road to redemption, if there was such a thing, would be paved with painful conversations and honest admissions. Amina had become a distant figure in his life, but he knew that the least he could do was try to express his regret. The divorce had not been an easy decision for her, but it had been a necessary one. The years of betrayal had worn her down, and now, she was focused on rebuilding her own life, with the children at her side. David had no delusions that he could win her back, but he needed her to know that he understood the extent of his actions. He reached out, sending her a simple message, no excuses, no explanations, just an acknowledgement of the hurt he had caused. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, because he didn't deserve it. But he hoped that, in time, Amina would find peace, and perhaps one day, their paths might cross again under different circumstances. Chinyere, on the other hand, remained an elusive figure. After the pregnancy was revealed, she had disappeared, taking the quiet exit that David had once hoped she would. He searched for her, hoping for an opportunity to speak with her, to apologize for what he had done. He had betrayed her too, in his own way. She had been a young woman with dreams, hopes, and aspirations, and David had used her as a way to escape from his own life. He had never seen her as more than a fleeting distraction, a mistake that had spun out of control. But now, he understood the depth of his betrayal. He understood that his selfishness had left a lasting impact, not just on Amina, but on Chinyere as well. Weeks turned into months, and as David faced the growing isolation of his personal life, his business slowly began to recover. The process was slow and painstaking, but he threw himself into his work, determined to rebuild the company that had once been his pride. He was no longer the charismatic leader he had been, he had shed that persona along with the shell of his past life. The boardroom meetings were no longer filled with bravado or self-assurance. Instead, they were characterized by a quiet determination to build something sustainable, something real. David had learned the hard way that true success wasn't about chasing after fleeting moments of glory, but about creating lasting value. He focused on rebuilding relationships with key partners, gaining their trust back one conversation at a time. Slowly, the pieces of his professional life began to fit back together, though it felt like he was putting together a shattered puzzle, one with gaps that would never be filled. David's most profound growth, however, was in his personal life. The emptiness he had once filled with ambition and external validation was slowly being replaced with something much more difficult to attain, self-acceptance. He began seeking therapy, something he had never thought he needed. He had been so focused on his outward success that he had neglected his inner world. Now, he was forced to look at the parts of himself that he had avoided for years. The pain, the insecurities, the reasons he had allowed himself to betray the people who loved him, these were the truths he had buried under the weight of his ambitions. The therapy sessions were painful at first. It was hard to face the reality of his actions and the impact they had on others. But slowly, David began to peel back the layers of his past, understanding how his childhood, his insecurities, and his relentless drive for success had shaped his behavior. He also started reconnecting with the people he had once taken for granted, his family, old friends, and colleagues who had been pushed aside in his pursuit of success. They had all distanced themselves from him after the scandal, and David had to work hard to rebuild those relationships. He started by making small, sincere gestures, like reaching out with a simple phone call or attending family events he had once avoided. These were not grand gestures of atonement, but quiet efforts to show that he was no longer the man who had once been so self-absorbed. Through all of this, David found himself facing a deeper question: who was he, really? Without the wealth, the mansion, the status, who was the man underneath? He began to understand that his true identity wasn't tied to his success or his mistakes, but to the choices he made moving forward. It was a sobering realization, but it brought him a sense of peace that he had never known before. He could no longer change the past, but he could control his future. And that was where his focus now lay. Months later, David found himself standing in front of the mansion, his home, but no longer his fortress. It had been sold, the final piece of his old life that had slipped through his fingers. The house that had once represented everything he had worked for was now a distant memory. He wasn't sad, though. There was no nostalgia for what he had lost. Instead, there was a strange sense of relief. He was no longer bound by the weight of his old life. The mansion had been a symbol of his ambition, but now, without it, he felt free. David had learned the hardest lesson of all, that life was not about what you had, but about who you were. The wealth, the fame, the accolades, they meant nothing without integrity. He understood now that success was about more than just achieving external goals. It was about building meaningful connections, being true to yourself, and taking responsibility for the consequences of your actions. As he walked away from the mansion for the last time, David knew that he had lost much, but he had also gained something far more valuable, the chance to rebuild his life, to become the man he had always needed to be. And for the first time in years, he felt a quiet hope rise within him. The future was uncertain, but at least he was no longer running from it. David wasn't perfect, and he knew that he would continue to face challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face them, to learn from them, and to create a future that was no longer defined by his past mistakes. It was a long road ahead, but David was prepared to walk it, step by step, with humility and hope. And though he may never fully mend the relationships he had broken, he could at least start with the one that mattered most, the one he had lost with himself. Months passed, and David's journey of self-reflection continued, though it had begun to take on a different shape. The pangs of regret never fully left him, they were a constant companion that he had come to accept, but they were no longer the loudest voice in his mind. There were still times when he would wake up in the middle of the night, his heart racing with the thought of Amina, or the haunting memory of his affair with Chinyere. But now, those thoughts were tempered with a quiet resolve. David was no longer trying to outrun his mistakes or bury them beneath his wealth and success. He had learned that running away from the past only prolonged the pain. It was only by confronting it head-on that he could begin to heal. Through his therapy sessions, David began to understand the root causes of his behavior. It wasn't just about his ambition or his need for validation, it was about a deep-seated fear of failure, a fear that had driven him to seek refuge in success. As a child, he had been taught that achievement was the key to survival. His parents had instilled in him a belief that only through hard work, through being the best, could he prove his worth to the world. But the irony was that as he climbed higher in life, the more he distanced himself from what truly mattered, his relationships, his integrity, his sense of self. Now, in the quiet of his own mind, David began to see the things that had once been so clear but that he had chosen to ignore. He had always been so focused on winning, on proving his worth to others, that he had neglected to ask the most important question: what was he truly living for? The answer, though simple, was one he had never considered before: connection. True connection with others, rooted in trust, understanding, and love. It was this understanding that slowly began to reshape his worldview. David knew, though, that understanding wasn't enough. He needed to act, to prove to himself and the people he had hurt that he was capable of change. So, he began taking tangible steps to make amends. His first priority was his children. The divorce from Amina had been a painful process for them as well, and though they had adapted to their new lives, David knew that his absence had left a void. He wasn't going to be the perfect father overnight, but he could start by being present, by making the time to listen to them, to show up for the moments that mattered. It wasn't easy, and there were times when they still resented him, when they would question why things had to change. But David was patient, listening more than speaking, understanding that his actions, not his words, would prove his commitment to being a better father. He also began reaching out to old friends and family members who had distanced themselves from him during the scandal. Some of them were skeptical, others angry, and some were simply indifferent. But David kept going, understanding that rebuilding trust was a slow process, one that required consistency. There were no grand gestures, no promises that could erase the past, but he was determined to show them through his actions that he was no longer the man they had once known, the man who had used his success to justify his mistakes. Slowly, over time, the walls that had been erected began to soften. The conversations were awkward at first, but with each one, David felt like a piece of the old, broken self was falling away. He wasn't perfect, and he knew he never would be, but he was trying. And that, for some, was enough. David's professional life continued to shift as well. The company was recovering, though it was no longer the empire it once was. He had sold off some assets, reorganized the structure, and focused more on building a sustainable future than on making a quick profit. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't carry the same allure it once had, but it felt right. He had learned that success wasn't about chasing after the next big thing, but about creating something that could endure. His leadership style had changed, too. Where once he had been brash and self-assured, now he was thoughtful and collaborative. He listened to his team, valuing their input and fostering an environment where transparency and honesty could thrive. It was a different kind of leadership, but one that felt more authentic to who he was becoming. Despite these changes, there were moments when David found himself standing still, paralyzed by the weight of his past. The ghosts of Amina and Chinyere would occasionally haunt him, and he would wonder whether there would ever be a way to fully make amends. The scars he had left on their lives were not something that could be erased with apologies or good intentions. There were times when he missed Amina terribly, when he wished things could have turned out differently. He longed for the life they had once shared, the laughter, the intimacy, the simplicity of their relationship before everything had been tainted by his actions. But David knew that those days were gone, and he couldn't live in the past. He had to accept that the relationships he had once cherished had changed forever, and that the only way to honor them now was to continue moving forward in a way that reflected the lessons he had learned. And then, one day, as if by chance, David received a letter from Amina. It wasn't a grand gesture, nor was it filled with the hope that they could rekindle what had been lost. The letter was simple, just a few lines, but it was enough to send a jolt through David's chest. In her words, there was no anger, no blame, just a quiet acknowledgement of the path they had both walked. She told him that she had forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own. She had come to terms with the past, and she no longer carried the weight of it with her. It wasn't the reconciliation David had hoped for, but it was something even more powerful. It was the gift of closure. David read the letter several times, each time feeling the emotional burden that had carried him for so long begin to lift. He knew that forgiveness didn't mean everything would be fixed or that things could return to what they once were, but it was a step toward healing. It was a step toward letting go of the shame that had defined his existence for so long. And with that, David felt a quiet peace settle over him. His journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt as though he was on the right path. In the months that followed, David continued his work, his personal growth, and his efforts to reconnect with the world around him. He understood now that the road to redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about learning from it, growing through it, and becoming the person he had always needed to be. The mansion he had once coveted was a distant memory, and with it, the man he used to be had faded away. David wasn't the same man who had betrayed his wife, who had made reckless choices in search of fulfillment. He was a man who had faced his demons, who had taken responsibility for his actions, and who was determined to build a life of integrity, no matter how long it took.